The morning it all made sense. I was standing in the dark outside my clinic with a flashlight in one hand and a lead line I didn't need in the other, because whatever had brought that wolf to my door was already gone. I'd been a veterinarian for 22 years by then. I had treated deer and foxes and once a great horned owl with a fractured wing that tried to put out my eye for the trouble. I was not a man who startled easy. I was not a man who let his imagination outpace what he could see and measure and write on a chart. But I stood there in the November dark with the flashlight sweeping across tracks in the frost that didn't belong to anything in my field guide, and I couldn't find the explanation I had spent my whole adult life reaching for automatically. I need to go back a few weeks to explain what I mean. Not because the story is complicated, because the only way I know to be honest about it is to show you where I was before it happened, so you understand what it cost me to see what I saw and still not look away. Carla died in the spring, a year and a half before that November. Pancreatic. Fast as those things go, which her doctor said like it was a mercy. And maybe it was. 18 months is long enough that people stopped asking how I was doing. I was grateful for that, mostly. I didn't have a good answer ready. What I had instead was a practice to run. 14 miles of gravel between me and the nearest town, 40 or so regular clients with livestock and working dogs, and barn cats they pretended not to be attached to. The work didn't fill the space Carla left. Nothing filled it. But the work had clear edges. An animal needed something specific and you provided it, or you didn't, and at the end of the day, you knew which. I understood work in a way I had stopped understanding most other things. The clinic was attached to the back of the house by a covered breezeway. I'd built that breezeway myself the summer we moved in. It leaked at the east seam every time it rained hard, and I never fixed it. And Carla used to set a pot under the drip and call it the indoor garden. When she was gone, I fixed it in about 40 minutes because the pot bothered me, and I didn't think about what I was doing until the job was done, and I was standing there with the caulk gun and nowhere to look. That's how it went, that first stretch. Not grief as a wave, the way people describe it. Grief as a series of small tasks completed in the wrong spirit. The coffee made for two before I remembered. The chair at the kitchen table pulled out by habit and then pushed back in. Little corrections every day, the accumulation of which is the shape of a loss. Carla had kept a stock trough near the Treeline, about 100 yards from the clinic. Not for our animals, which had a proper automatic waterer in the run. This trough was for whatever came out of the woods on its own terms. She'd filled it every other day, winter and summer, rain or dry, and she'd kept a small log of what visited. Whitetails mostly, a few raccoons, once a black bear cub who'd apparently not gotten the message that humans were to be avoided. She'd been pleased about that bear for 2 weeks. She had a photograph on a lanyard she kept in her coat pocket, and she showed it to clients who probably didn't care, and they were kind enough to pretend they did. I stopped filling the trough in May, about 6 weeks after the funeral. I told myself it wasn't practical without someone tracking it consistently. The truth was simpler and harder to name. Standing at that trough, looking at the tree line Carla had looked at for 15 years, was something my body would not do. So I stopped going near it. By October, the trough was empty and had been for months. Maud was my border collie. 11 years old, grey along her muzzle, both hips giving her trouble on cold mornings. She had been Carla's dog first, and mine second, and she had made no secret of that ordering. In the months after the funeral, she moved her sleeping place from the bedroom to the kitchen, which was closer to the door, and I understood this as a kind of vigil I did not have the right to interrupt. She ate well enough. She still came to the clinic with me in the mornings and curled under the steel exam table while I worked, which she had always done. She was not a demonstrative dog. She was a steady one. In that season, steady was what I needed from her. Early November came with a freeze that settled into the ground in the first week and did not let go. My firewood was stacked along the north wall of the clinic, 3 cords that I'd split and loaded myself over September because the splitting was something to do with my hands. I had a schedule: mornings in the clinic, afternoons on the road for farm calls, evenings alone with whatever I could eat without much preparation, and whatever quiet I could tolerate before sleep. It was a Monday in early November when I noticed the trough. I was coming back from checking on a ewe one of my clients had called about, cutting across the backfield with Maud at my heel, and I glanced toward the tree line out of a habit I hadn't managed to unlearn. The trough caught the low afternoon light in a way it hadn't in months, and I understood why when I got closer. It was full. Clean water, not frozen, though the temperature had been below 30 for 4 nights running. I stood there longer than I needed to. I ran through what I knew. A trench in the ground warmed by underground water could keep a trough from freezing at certain temperatures, but we didn't have that kind of spring near there. A neighbour could have come through the back pasture without stopping at the house, but Roy was the only neighbour likely to do something like that, and Roy wasn't the type to do it without mentioning it. I could have filled it myself, sleep-deprived and absent-minded, and simply not remembered. That last one was the explanation I settled on because it was the most uncomfortable and, therefore, by my reasoning, the most likely to be true. A man pushing 56 and running short on sleep and not eating well could do things and forget them. I'd done it with the coffee pot twice that fall. I noted it and moved on. That was what I told myself. I was good at moving on. I had made a practice of it. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not the kind of man who invites the inexplicable. I spent 4 years in veterinary school learning to weigh evidence, and I spent 22 years in practice applying that to animals who couldn't tell me what hurt. My first instinct in any situation is to find the mechanism, not the meaning, the mechanism. If you knew me, you would say that was accurate, maybe generous. So when I tell you what happened in mid-November, I want you to understand I went through every door of explanation I had before I stopped at the one that had no explanation on the other side of it. It was a Thursday, 4:30 in the morning. Maud woke me, which she never did. She wasn't barking. She was standing beside the bed with her feet planted and her nose pointing at the door to the breezeway, very still, the way working dogs go still when they've made a decision and are waiting for you to catch up. I lay there for a moment listening. I could hear the wind had dropped. The clinic was quiet. Then I heard it, a low, unsteady sound from the clinic door. Not a knock, more like a weight settled against the wood, and the door shifting in its frame from the pressure. I got up. I put on my boots without thinking about it, reached for the flashlight on the bedside table, pulled a coat over my shoulder. 22 years had trained certain responses into me, and they ran on their own in the dark. When I opened the breezeway door into the clinic, Maud came through ahead of me and sat down in the center of the room without circling, without sniffing the perimeter, the way she would have if something alarmed her. She just sat. Her ears were up, and her eyes were on the exterior door, and her tail moved once, slowly, which I had never seen her do for an animal she didn't know. I crossed to the exterior door and turned the flashlight on before I opened it. The wolf was lying on the concrete step. Left foreleg tucked under its body at an angle that told me immediately the leg was the problem. A timber wolf, male, big, somewhere between 85 and 100 pounds, I guessed from the look of him. His eyes were open and they moved to me when the door opened and then moved away, which was the first thing that surprised me. A wild wolf with a serious injury in a strange doorway should have been afraid of me. This one was tired and in pain and present, but not afraid. I looked past him. The flashlight reached to the edge of the gravel lot, and then the dark took over. I swept it left and right. I saw the wolf's tracks in the frost, three-legged and dragging on the left, crossing the lot from the direction of the back field. And alongside those tracks, in a parallel line, were prints I held the flashlight on for a long time. Roughly 18 inches across, 5 toes with significant depth at the ball, the weight distributed forward. The stride between them was nearly 5 feet. Whatever had made those prints had been walking, not running. It had walked beside the wolf from the field edge to my door, and then it had stopped, about 8 feet back from the step, and the prints there overlapped like it had stood for a time, and then they moved back toward the field and were gone. I am a careful man. I looked at those tracks for 4 or 5 minutes before I let myself conclude that I was seeing them correctly. Then I went inside, got my kit, put on my examination gloves, and went back to the wolf. His name was not mine to give, so I did not give him one. I examined him the way I examined everything. Methodically, talking low and continuous, not because I thought he understood me, but because the sound of a calm voice is its own kind of language that most animals read accurately. The foreleg had a deep laceration at the lower joint, consistent with a wire fence at speed. No fracture, which was luck. The wound was a day old, maybe less, and had not gone infected yet, but was raw enough that I knew it would without treatment. I held a state wildlife rehabilitation certification that I had maintained for 11 years, because Carla had thought it was important, and because she was right. It covered exactly this situation. I noted that to myself with a specificity that surprised me, as if some part of me was already preparing to explain what I was about to do. I carried him inside in a blanket. 94 pounds of wolf, which I know exactly because I weighed him on the clinic scale as soon as I had him settled, from professional habit rather than any particular reason. I cleaned the wound with iodine solution, packed it, put in 4 sutures, wrapped it in a light compression bandage, and gave him a course of antibiotics that I had on hand for canine patients of similar weight. He held still through most of it with his head flat on the table and his eyes open. Maud lay on the floor beneath the table the entire time, her chin on her paws, perfectly quiet. I set up one of the large outdoor kennels in the covered run alongside the clinic, bedded it with clean straw, put down water, and the closest thing I had to appropriate food, which was a package of raw venison a client had brought as payment the previous week. Then I moved the wolf to the kennel and latched it. He went without resistance. He settled into the straw and closed his eyes while I was still kneeling there, watching him. Maud sat outside the kennel door and did not move for an hour. I sat beside her on an overturned bucket with my hands in my lap and the flashlight off because the sun was coming up by then, and there was enough grey light to see by. I want to tell you honestly what I felt sitting there because this is the part that is hardest to translate into plain language. I had been sealed up tight for 18 months. Not numb, sealed. The way a house feels when you've closed all the windows against something that's been going on outside, and you've been inside so long you've stopped remembering the windows are closed. Sitting beside that wolf in the early light, with Maud's shoulder against my knee, I had the strange, specific sensation that something had gotten in anyway. I'm not a person who believes in things I can't explain. I want to be clear about that. The day went the way days go in a one-man practice. I had 3 scheduled appointments in the morning and a farm call in the afternoon for a gelding with thrush. I went to all of them. I came back between appointments to check on the wolf, to change the water, to make sure he was eating. He was, carefully, and the wound was not inflaming. By evening, I was confident he would heal without complication if I kept the infection from setting in. Roy came by around 5 that afternoon. He stood at the clinic door with a covered dish, which meant his wife had sent it, and he looked at the kennel situation with his hands in his pockets and didn't ask any questions, which was why Roy was the neighbour I had. "You got a wolf," he said. "He came to the door," I said. Roy nodded like that was a reasonable thing to happen. "Helen made soup," he said, and held out the dish and left. That was the whole conversation. I ate the soup standing at the clinic counter, and I thought about what Roy would have said if I'd told him about the tracks. I decided I would not tell Roy about the tracks. It was after Roy left that I went out to check the trough. The water had been filled again. I had not filled it. I knew this with certainty because I had not gone near the trough in 6 days, and I had begun paying attention to whether I was doing things I couldn't remember after the first incident in early November. But it was the other thing that stopped me. Around the base of the trough, set into the frozen ground in a ring that was clearly deliberate, were 11 flat stones. River stones, most of them smooth and grey-brown, about the size of my palm each. They had been placed with a care that I cannot describe better than to say it looked intentional, the way the laying on of hands looks intentional. Not arranged in a pattern I recognized, not a letter or a symbol from anything in my experience, but not random. Nothing about it was random. I crouched in the frozen grass and looked at those stones for a long time. I counted them 3 times. 11. I looked at the ground around the trough for tracks, and I found 2 partial impressions in the earth near the tree line, the same general shape as the ones I'd seen in the frost by the clinic door. I found them, and I looked at them, and I stood up and walked back to the clinic. I sat in the chair I kept by the wood stove, and I went through my rational explanations the way you run your hand down a fence line looking for the break. A person could have arranged those stones. A person could have filled the trough. Both things were physically possible for a large adult human, but the tracks were not human tracks, and no vehicle had come down my road that day, and I had been home all afternoon. Whatever had done this had come from the trees and gone back to the trees without using the road. My second explanation was that I had misread the tracks entirely, that they were deer or elk at a strange depth and angle. I had 22 years of reading animal sign, and I didn't believe that, but I held it up and looked at it anyway, because that is what I do. My third explanation was that I was not as okay as I had been telling Roy and Helen, and my clients and the feed store owner, and everyone else who had asked in the declining frequency of the months since the funeral, that I was seeing things shaped by what I wanted to see, that the trough and the stones were random arrangement, and I was supplying the intention because I needed there to be intention. I held that one for the longest time. It was the most painful, and therefore, by my old logic, the most likely. But I had counted 11 stones. I had measured the tracks against my boot. I had done both of those things with the same hands and the same eyes I'd used for 22 years to measure and count things that mattered. I was not ready to declare those hands and eyes unreliable. I went back outside and I looked at the stones one more time in the last of the light. What I thought, crouched there in the cold with the tree line going dark ahead of me, was this. Carla had filled this trough for 15 years because she believed in the courtesy of it. She believed the woods were paying attention and that you owed the woods a certain acknowledgement in return. I had thought this was one of the soft beliefs I could hold at arm's length and still love her for. I was standing in front of evidence that I did not know what to do with, and the evidence was arranged around the one thing she had asked me to keep that I had stopped keeping. I did not sleep well that night, but for the first time in months, I did not sleep poorly because the house was too quiet. I slept poorly because I was thinking. If you've ever had a moment where what you thought was possible quietly shifted on you, you know that it doesn't arrive as a revelation. It arrives as a question you can no longer avoid asking. Drop a comment below if you've had something like that. I imagine there are more of us than we say. The wolf's wound was healing cleanly by the end of the first week. I had transitioned him to a softer bandage, was checking him twice daily, and his weight had steadied. He was eating well, and he had begun to stand at the kennel door in the mornings and watch me cross the yard with an attention that was not the wariness of a wild animal, but something closer to recognition. I had no category for what I was seeing in his face. I did not try to manufacture one. Maud visited him every morning, sitting outside the kennel with her nose through the wire, and he would come to her, and they would be close for a few minutes in the way that animals who understand each other are close, without theatre, without anxiety. I watched them and kept my thoughts to myself. In the second week of December, the wolf was gone. I came out to the morning feeding, and the kennel was empty. The latch was closed. Not broken, not forced. Closed and latched as it should have been. The straw was compressed where he had slept, and there was a track in the frost near the kennel door, a single three-legged print where he'd tested the leg on the cold ground, and then 3 feet beyond it, a four-legged print, the weight even, and then more of them heading toward the backfield in a straight line. He had healed enough to walk on it. Something had let him out, and whatever that something was had left no sign except the tracks I'd been seeing for a month. Moving away from my property toward the tree line, the stride long and unhurried. I stood there with my hands in my coat pockets for a while. Maud sat beside me and looked where I was looking. I had been carrying a question since mid-November, and I did not have an answer for it, and I understood by then that I was not going to get one in the form I was trained to expect. What I had instead was this: something large enough to carry or accompany a 94-pound wolf 14 miles across frozen ground to the one place in the county equipped to treat it, had brought that animal to my door in the dark. That same something had been filling a trough that Carla had kept, and it had been doing this either since she stopped being able to or since I stopped being willing to. And it had placed 11 stones around that trough in an arrangement that was not accidental, in the dark, without needing me to witness it. I could not explain the mechanism. I had run out of mechanisms. What I could do, and what I did that same morning, was go to the equipment shed, fill a 5-gallon bucket from the hose, and carry it to the trough. The water steamed a little in the cold air when I poured it. The stones were still there, undisturbed. I stood back and looked at them, and thought about Carla's photograph of the bear cub that she'd kept on a lanyard in her coat pocket. I thought about how she'd told me once, not as an argument but as a settled belief, that the woods would look after the things you looked after, given enough time and enough patience. I had listened to her say this, and I had appreciated it as a thing she needed to believe, and I had not believed it myself. I am 56 years old, and I have spent my life in the specific company of living things that cannot tell me what they need, except by how they hold their bodies, and where their eyes go, and whether they can eat. I thought I knew what evidence looked like. That evening I called Dennis. He lives in Colorado, works for a civil engineering firm, and we had not spoken in any real way since Carla's funeral. Not a dramatic estrangement, nothing said that could not be unsaid, just the accumulated weight of 2 men who did not know how to be father and son, without a woman between them who understood both of them better than they understood each other. He was 31. He had called twice in the spring, and I had been short with him both times because short was all I had to offer, and after that he had stopped calling. I could not blame him for stopping. The phone rang 4 times, and I thought he wouldn't answer, and then he did. "Dad, careful, not cold, careful." "I know it's late," I said. I stopped. I had rehearsed something and it had left me. "I wanted to hear your voice." There was a silence, not an angry one, something else. "Are you okay?" he said. "Not completely," I said. "Not yet. Getting there." Another silence. Then, "I've been meaning to call." "I know," I said. "Me too." We talked for 20 minutes, mostly about small things. His work, a project in Utah he was traveling to in January, whether the clinic had been busy. He asked about Maud, which meant he was asking about me without knowing how to ask about me. And I answered that she was doing all right, which was the same answer for both of them. We did not talk about Carla, not directly. We did not talk about the spring when I had been too hollow to receive what he was offering. Near the end, he said he might be able to come out in February if things at work aligned, and I said I'd like that, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant much in a long time. When I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while with the phone on the table. The kitchen did not feel too large. It still felt empty in the ways it was always going to feel empty. But a thing had shifted in the small and practical way that things can shift when you stop requiring them to shift all at once. I thought about what had made me pick up the phone. Not the wolf exactly, not the stones exactly. The recognition that something had been paying enough attention to deliver an injured animal to my door in the dark and fill a trough I had abandoned and arrange 11 stones around it in a shape I had no name for. Whatever that something was, it had done all of that without any sign of needing me to acknowledge it, without any apparent requirement that I understand it or believe in it or explain it. It had simply done what the situation called for, and then gone back to wherever it came from. If that was the model available to me, I thought I could try to work from it. The spring came in pieces, the way spring does in that country. A week of cold followed by 3 days of warmth, followed by one hard frost that killed the buds on my apple tree and then gave them back. By April, the backfield was soft enough to walk without the ground taking your boot. By May, the tree line was green from the bottom up, and you could hear the frogs starting in the low spots at dusk. Dennis came in February, as he'd said he would. 4 days, which was longer than I expected. We worked on the fence along the north pasture most of the first day without saying much, and by the second day we were talking in the way we used to, long conversations that drifted from one thing to another without needing a destination. He helped me rehang the breezeway door, which had been sticking since October. He slept in the room that had been his as a teenager, and I heard him up early 2 mornings, and I did not ask what kept him up, because I already knew, and he knew I knew. Before he left, we walked out to the trough together. I had been filling it every other day since December. He stood there for a minute, looking at the stones, which I hadn't moved and hadn't explained. "Mum's thing," he said finally. "Her trough," I said. He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the stones and at the tree line and then at me. He didn't ask anything else, and I didn't offer anything else, and that was the right amount for both of us. There are things I have told 1 or 2 people and things I have not told anyone. The tracks are in the second category. The stone arrangement I have told almost no one. Dennis knows the trough is being kept and that it matters, and that is enough of the truth for him to carry right now. The rest of it I have been carrying alone and have, over the course of this past year, stopped finding that as heavy as it was. I don't know what brought that wolf to my door. I know what the tracks looked like, and I know what the arrangement of those 11 stones looked like, and I know that the wolf arrived injured at 4 in the morning at the one place within 14 miles that could treat him, and I know that the kennel latch was closed and intact when he was gone. I know what my training says about evidence, and I know that my training has no drawer for this. I've looked. What I do know, with the same certainty I have about the things I can measure, is that something noticed the trough empty and decided it should not be. Something noticed a wound and decided to carry its bearer to the hands that could close it. Whether those were connected acts by the same patient, careful thing, I cannot prove. I believe they were. That belief sits in me differently than the beliefs I can diagram. It doesn't require me to argue for it. It simply sits there like a stone in a ring I didn't lay and can't stop seeing clearly. I have spent 22 years as a veterinarian learning to read the body's signals before the animal can name what it needs. I know what it looks like when something is afraid. I know what it looks like when something is in pain. I know what it looks like in the particular language of a dog's posture and a horse's eye and a cat's withdrawal when something has decided to trust you. That wolf trusted my door before it trusted me. Maud trusted whatever had carried him there before I was awake enough to know to. I think about that. In the mornings mostly, when I carry the bucket out to the trough in whatever light there is, and Maud comes with me at her old dog pace with her grey muzzle low to the ground, reading whatever the night left behind. She sits beside the trough when I pour the water. She has done this every morning since February without being asked, the way she used to sit beside Carla's feet when Carla did the same job. She doesn't look at me when she does it. She looks at the tree line. I look there too, now. Not searching, not waiting for something to happen. Just looking, the way you look at something you have decided to take seriously. The tree line is the same tree line it has always been, dark at the center and lit along the edge in the early morning. And whatever is in there is its own business and will remain so. I am not owed any further explanation, and I have stopped needing one. The stones are still around the trough. The freeze-thaw of winter shifted 2 of them, and I set them back. I don't know if that matters. I did it anyway. Maud settles into the frost-heavy grass each morning and watches the woods with her ears up and her eyes patient. Some mornings she puts her nose up and reads something on the air that I can't read, and her tail moves once, slowly, the way it did the morning the wolf was on my step. I don't ask her what she knows. She wouldn't tell me, and she doesn't need to. The woods have been looking after the things I look after. That is enough.